Oh, me. All right. Tonight I felt like a Baptist minister, but I decided to have a corn muffin instead. The only reason I said that silly thing about the minister was that what I was going to say, it struck me to take off on at least a couple of the things that I pointed out before, doing these kind of stories that I used to hear ministers do about. Last week a parishioner came to me, and they do all that, which even at an early age I think disturbed some people that called on that he's making that up, and he's supposed to be the guy that's in charge of encouraging us in the ways of veracity. But at any rate, here it goes. One time, some time back, I happened to be in, let us say, a social occasion, and some people got talking business, and I'd met a few of them, and it turns out that they were in the advertising game. And one man was talking about the difficulty of really getting his money's worth for his clients in TV advertising. It was to the point that even a Crazy Eddie in New York, wouldn't get many people's attention, and he was considering things like having somebody commit suicide so that you would at least notice the name, and as the guy was killing him, that sort of silly stuff. And so I listened for a while, and I was sort of staying at the edge of the conversation, and I told the guy, I said, all right, I'll tell you how to get your money's worth. I'll tell you how to make people remember, for instance, what do you want? Like the name of the place. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, all right, the name and the phone number. He said, that'd be real good, because the business was the kind that would be best served through advertising if people would see the ad and then call up so that they could get their name and where they live and that sort of thing. So I said, all right, I'll tell you how. And I said, it's never been done, and I'll tell you how to do it. I'll tell you how those watching it all, giving any attention, in ways that you have never considered, and way out of the ordinary ratio, whatever your considered figures are in the game about how many people see a spot and how many respond to it or remember it. And so he said, okay. And I said, here's what you do. And you may only have to run this spot once in each area, if it was at the right time. At any rate, you have the guy give some little pitch, whatever it is, and then have him look at the camera and say, and for this introductory offer, for more information, right here in this area, New York, whatever, local, right here in Miami, Los Angeles, call 629-4... Damn, that's the wrong number. Call 626-9494. That's it. So I told the guy, I said, people that see that, it'll do something to them. And I made sure he understood, and he said, yeah, the guy seriously pretends he gives out the wrong number almost all the way through. I said, yeah, maybe have him go through the 634-9292. And then, no, it's not. It's 626. So the guy said, well, that's kind of interesting. He had a few drinks, and of course I didn't expect it to go anywhere. But after all this time, I think it's time to revive that. And I'm going to, that was sort of to ease you into this. It could be known as the FF method, the faux fallaciousness. But once I get into it, those of you who can hear it, I might as well cut that short. Faux fallaciousness is a whole lot of letters, which is all right. But here's what it should really be known as. You can take your choice tonight. It's just the nutso method. Because if we had ordinary people here, it is really nuts. But here's what you do. You're faced with a situation, whatever that situation is. And any form of new intelligence, any sort of revolutionary insight, any sort of alternative approach and thinking to what seems to be this situation that requires, as far as you're concerned, some thought on your part, some response, some reaction, some verbal comment, and you just can't seem to get a handle on it at all. Here's what you do. You publicly, or you can do it yourself if you know how, but most of you need to start off to do it publicly, that is to somebody, is to make what you consider, which is the only thing that's important, what you consider right there on the spot, there's no problem. Well, some of you may find a little tricky place there. But what you do is announce, proclaim an idea, an answer, if it seems to be a question, that as far as you're concerned is knowingly, purposefully incorrect. And you just simply do it. In the same way that I told you that ad, the guy says, for more information, to avail yourself of this offer, call 623-7979. No. It's 626-7979. In that same way that you appeared just to be just as serious and that you had scripted it right on the spot, as you make, as far as you're concerned, or you deliver an answer, you produce an idea that as far as you know, as far as you're concerned right that second, it is fallacious, it is incorrect, it is not an answer, much less the answer to whatever the situation seems to be. But it's not even, as far as you're concerned, an answer. It is fallacious, except you got to know it. The same way as my ad man, you don't leave him to wing it when you're paying for production time to film this and then run it on the air. The man knows beforehand to give the wrong answer first, the wrong phone number. Call 634-7979. No. That's 626. He knows it's wrong, but it's got to be scripted, and he looks serious, like everything's going along fine. That is the way to use the FF method. It has, since most of you are still looking kind of FF'd about this, maybe I should point out some of the ways in which this can be used, if it doesn't immediately grab you. For one thing, it gives you, I'll start off and I'll build up. It gives you additional breathing room. It gives you additional time. That's real minor. To some of you it may seem like a big deal, because I know many people feel as though that you are confronted with continual pressures to deal with people in ordinary life, even on a verbal basis, without appearing to be foolish or uncertain. So at the very least it does that for you. It also gives you the opportunity to experience some unexpected neural connections, simply by saying the best you can on the spot, just to wing it, to say something as far as you're concerned, as far as you can tell, is a fallacious response, an incorrect and unworkable idea, and you say it as seriously as the guy gives out the wrong phone number. It gives the opportunity for you to make unexpected connections. Somewhat related to that, it also helps interfere with you thinking and using the same old material over and over and over, because you would have never done this. This is material you would have never used, and forget your own city consciousness saying, well, sure, I'd never used it because it's wrong. Now let's get closer to the more serious. I was building up gradually. It gives you the possibility to have a kind of silly freedom from what would ordinarily be your serious self, which of course would never, no matter who you are, would never willfully, knowingly give a fallacious answer. You simply would not. Now, of course, in life, everyone believes that it's happened to them, that they made a fool of themselves, that they committed a sophism or a good old fox pass. But at the time, they didn't mean to. Let me have to back up and explain it. Well, I didn't mean to say that. You misunderstood me. I didn't have all the facts and all that shit. But to do this is a kind of normally untouched freedom and I'm referring to as silly, as opposed to you being normally serious, even when after the fact you apparently did make a fallacious suggestion, because you're still serious. As soon as you think that you've been found out, or as soon as you realize, boy, that was a dumb idea I just gave, then you have to say something like, oh, you people knew I was joking, didn't you? See, that's deadly serious, to tell them that you were joking once you realize that, hey, that sounds dumb. To do it willfully, to start off, you do not have to go back and apologize. In fact, if you do, you have erased the whole method. And so you have got a kind of silly freedom from what is everyone's normally deadly serious self. This is connected with even another step, that it should be able, while you're experiencing this kind of freedom, when you can taste it, to remind you of the unnoticed complexity of everything, inasmuch as your fallacious idea, once you get in that kind of free time of freedom, you may see, in fact, very likely has some merit. And you tried your best, if you're following my method, that you just open your mouth and you could just feel that this is wrong. And if wrong is not the appropriate adjective, it's improper, it's silly, it's unworkable, it is fallacious, it's nutso. And you say it, and it may strike you shortly as you're standing there. You know, that has about as much merit as if I'd come up with something else. Because we're not dealing simply, by now you should suspect on your own, with answers, ideas being nouns, being things, and that one of them, that you have an idea or a suggestion and you lay it out and somebody looks at it and says, this is broken. This thing is maladroit. This thing is cracked. This thing is lopsided. The ideas, the suggestions that people think they're dealing with brings up what I would suggest that some of you should find interesting. Another question, or I guess the first question for the night. Would not ordinary consciousness, ordinary intelligence say that the opposite of ignorance would have to surely be knowledge? I mean, it's got to be. But then, the question, there's a little string of questions here coming up. If the opposite of ignorance is knowledge, then the questions are, does that mean any kind of knowledge? That any kind of knowledge is an adequate opposite for ignorance? Shaky knowledge? Questionable knowledge? Suspect knowledge? Would that still, as far as city intelligence, unless you of course smelled a rat and thought I was going to trick you when I started this, wouldn't that still fit? Go back to your own city level, the idea that in some situation, some area, you hear a question or you're trying to pursue some line of thought, and it suddenly strikes you that I don't know this. Ignorance. All right, the opposite of ignorance is knowledge. But does that mean, if you were talking to someone and you say, well, I've gone as far as I can, I was going to make another comment, but I'm going to tell you the truth, I don't know the answer to the very question I was about to ponder, that I was leading up to. And when some other person standing there around the crowd discussing things says, well, here's what I think, and it appears to be the opposite of ignorance, because you said, I don't know. I was engaged in this kind of philosophical dream weaving, and I sort of painted myself in the corner, and I don't know where to go from here. I don't know the answer to that. And this other guy goes, well, I think. So it appears to be that we're going to have something absolutely fitting as an opposite or at least seriously approaching it, because he says, well, I have this to say, or I know this. Does any sort of knowledge in any situation constitute the opposite of ignorance? Now, some of you may think you're getting sharp and go, well, no, because what if the knowledge was wrong? Well, then it's ignorance. But nobody defines if you're going to accept that some other something, that we got ignorance to start here, and we're trying to find the opposite of ignorance. We're trying to determine, which everybody knew before I started this. It was quite clear, I'm sure. But now we're going to determine what is actually the opposite of ignorance. Right? It's knowledge. Right? Here's the knowledge we got over here on this subject. Is this acceptable? And some of you still may think you're sharp enough that you say, well, we would have to examine this so-called knowledge to a greater degree. To what degree? That's what I'm already asking you. To what degree? How are you going to decide whether this particular knowledge... Everybody understands what I'm asking, don't you, without me making up any further examples, that we just got an area somewhere. Let's take it outside the hard sciences and such, the real serious questions about human nature and life. And there's one place over here that you're thinking about or talking about, and it's ignorance. Right, to fill this up, the opposite of ignorance, by any thesaurus, surely is going to say is knowledge. So all you got to do is find something, some knowledge to put there on that, and we'll take care of that ignorance. But is that sufficient to say knowledge? Now, I've wandered around here talking for 4 or 5 minutes about this, so let me try and zero in a little more specifically, verbal-wise. Under ordinary conditions, is the kind of acceptable knowledge is going to be a cure, which of course is what I'm saying when I say an antonym or an opposite, an anecdote. There's got to be a cure for the ignorance. It's going to do away with ignorance and replace it with this knowledge. But at the ordinary level, are there not determinations, expectations of what suitable knowledge is going to be? And far beyond any idea about, well, I don't know whether the knowledge is absolutely correct. We don't know whether it's going to eradicate all of the possible ignorance in this area. You're beating around your neural bushes like everybody else. I'd put it to you this way. Would not the knowledge, from your view, now that's all we're going to worry about, your view city-wise, if you were the one person listening to this, does not the knowledge have to be agreeable knowledge? Does it not have to be expected knowledge? That is what makes it correct knowledge. But now, see if you can jump back with me about 2 minutes ago, back, and look at it another way. What if you determined that your reaction to a piece of knowledge was, that is highly suspect? I did not expect to hear that answer. Is there any way that, right there on the spot, that you could ever accept that knowledge as being the opposite of that ignorance that it was purported to replace? Now forget whether we're talking about mathematics or something that was open to so-called clinical proof right then. It's there you stand in the so-called knowledge that's presented. Because if you really get tricky, what if you some way thought about it yourself instead of it being presented to you? But that's for those of you that are running fast tonight. What if the knowledge that you, as soon as you heard it, it was so unexpected as to be unexpected? Could you, there on the spot, now forget that there's any way that you had some immediate so-called objective or scientific proof that the knowledge you just heard can't be true. The area is too vague for that. It's just, you're saying, well, I don't know the answer to that. And another person over here says, well, here's what I've decided, and they say it. And it's so surprising. Could you accept that? If you were ordinary intelligence, could you accept that as usable knowledge to replace a piece of ignorance under discussion? No. Oh, I gave it away. Now, I didn't mean to shake my head, because what I meant to do was say it's 626. Oh, how about a little further? What I started on, well, let me put it in fairly direct terms. Does ignorance in all forms, uncertainty, fears, ignorance, but does ignorance actually exist as a noun? Now it's listed as a noun somewhere, some version of it. Can ignorance exist alone without a man, not a person, to experience it? There are several other areas I could bring up, but this is a prime one, since this has to do, all of this ultimately, with working upon that part of your nervous system that is involved with so-called knowledge and ignorance, as opposed to strength and weakness in the body, or unusual passions, or control of passion, which is all that's a side effect. But since it's directly concerned with this, consider whether or not, people speak of ignorance as a thing, but how can you have ignorance if you didn't have a person to be ignorant? If that's true, if ignorance is simply a potential verb, how can it have an opposite? How can there be a cure for ignorance? How can, if you've got a blank somewhere in your city thinking, in your city storehouse, cache of knowledge, there's some holes, to say the least. How can those holes ever be filled? Back at city level of consciousness now, how can they ever be filled? That there are gaps, things that you say I'm ignorant of. I don't know what happens. I do not know what happens, say you at city level, to people after they die. Or I do not understand how people can be so unfeeling as to do such and such, to kill another person. I can't understand how someone could steal from their own family. I cannot understand that. I am ignorant of it. Is there any possible cure for that ignorance? It is treated as though, without any analyzation, it is treated as though ignorance is a thing. But now some of you have already laughed. This is not playing with words, as you should know by now. That's not the point. If you don't see any further than that, then you've missed the point. But it is treated as though ignorance is actually a commodity, that it's goods. Well, think about it. People talk about ignorance that can be treated. You go to school, you go ask somebody. But if ignorance is a thing, then where is it if you don't have anybody around? Let me update that good old Zen puzzle. Does ignorance exist if there's nobody around to ignorant it? If you got this forest and it's full of, or at least has some ignorance, and no humans there, how do you know that there's some ignorance out there in the woods? Unless there's somebody to go out there and step in it. Unless there's somebody to be ignorant. If that's the case, what is the opposite of any verb? How are you going to cure a verb? You can cure a noun, but how are you going to cure a verb? Get a stick maybe and say bad verb, and down, stop it. If you could do that, how would you attack? All right, now let's expand a little bit, that we're not dealing with this elusive ignorance. That now we've got a person who says, the demon is in me right now. I've got ignorance in me. And you've got the stick. Where are you going to beat the person? And to what avail to say, come out, you bad ignorance? Or to tell the man, don't be ignorant. The man says, I'm trying not to be. And you say, well, stop it. And he says, I can't. Part of the secret message and all that, which I'm afraid was too secret. No, I have no doubt that it's obvious that some of you were hearing certain parts. The nervous system works in such a way that when it talks, which is a fair, of course, again, three-dimensional definition of man, is the one with the talking molecules. There are many things that are taken as being goods that are services. They're things that are taken as being nouns that will not even hold up to ordinary city, rhetorical, linguistic examination, but they're taken consistently as being nouns when they cannot be. They do not even fit the city's definition of a noun. Because if you take away that which can experience it, and of course that I'm referring to a person, if you take the person away, do we have a person that you'll stand there and admit, or I got this person admits, all right, I'm a person in this particular area right this second that I have some ignorance about something. And I'll admit it. And I say, well, thank you. Now, we've got a person with ignorance. Does everybody understand that? You all nod, and he says, I do. And he describes what his ignorance is. He said, I don't understand so-and-so. So I say, fine. So we've got a person, and he has some ignorance here. And you say, yes. That's right. Sir, would you, or madam, would you go behind the curtain and leave the room for a minute? If they do, what do we have left? Well, what if I say, all right, would you leave, but leave the ignorance here? We won't talk about you while you're gone. Just get behind the curtain, maybe, and you can listen. But just leave the ignorance. And yet it is treated. I guess I've done enough of that for you people to laugh and either think at city level that I am being silly and playing with words, or if you get above city level, it does that, and you have to. But such things as ignorance and knowledge, are treated as though they are nouns. Even though somebody might say, well, the way you get education, the way to get knowledge is you have to go to school, which in a sense is a process. But they still treat it as though it is a commodity, that you go and you pay your tuition, is the basis of it, to get you in there. And of course you've got to work, but there is something going on. When you leave, they even give you a thing called a degree that certifies that that institution, which is recognized by other institutions, the state or the church, which is recognized by other institutions, add you know what. You can't go much further, you get the willies, and you think, what the hell did I go here for? But at any rate, to wonder who finally accredited who threw the first ball out. But at any rate, it is treated as though knowledge is something that's available. I'm paying money. I meet the requirements of attending class such and such time. But now you hear, I've done, as I said, surely far enough in that one direction. It's more than that, so don't just think I'm still beating that one little funny part, or the part that made you laugh. In a university, from Harvard all the way down to the Superman night law school, you cannot go in there and find knowledge. They'll point to books. They'll point to lab equipment. They'll point to Professor so-and-so, who's a recognized authority in his field. But there is no knowledge laying around anywhere. It is not a commodity, and yet the nervous system treats it as such. And it treats it as being the commodity to make up for a lack of commodity that you have in some area known as ignorance. That you in some way are going to get the knowledge and move it over, which is the only way that it'll ever be valuable like anything else. You've got to move it from where it is, wherever you go to find it in a book or somebody else, or stumble on it yourself, and then you've got to move it. It may internally just be immeasurable by my physical gestures, but it's got to be moved up here, now I got that, and then you move it over where you didn't have it. Remember, that's simply the three-dimensional commerce. That's the way it goes. Nothing has any value until it's moved from its original site. And so you move the knowledge, and you move it over, and it replaces the ignorance. Right? The part I never did get very specific about that, I said was sort of a little secret in the midst of all that. It's not as bad, yeah it is, as it sounds. And in case you wonder, just call 634-7. No, that's, God, it's 626. All right, it's not as bad. Yeah, it is. Okay. This is going to sound pretty. No, it won't. Call 6. You follow me? All right, I'll go ahead and say it. From a certain view, see, this leaves you a rat hole way out. From a certain view, that which is called ignorance at city level cannot be cured. Of course, I've told you people that a long time ago. But the city level that hears that has to dismiss it out of hand. It's like trying to throw down a whole gulp of 190 grain proof grain alcohol. Can't be done. If you can get it down, it'll come back just as fast as it went down. Ordinary intelligence can hear that nothing can be done about it, and it might as well. I have thrown down a nice big mouthful of 190 proof alcohol, and it hears it and goes, bleh. It has no choice. You can't control your stomach unless you are on the verge of death. You cannot drink pure grain alcohol. You can chant, you can swear you will, it goes down, it comes right back up. Ordinary intelligence hears, nothing can be done about you. Well, yeah. It has no choice, no control over it. That which appears to be ignorance in the city cannot be cured. And if you can hear good, it can't really be treated. But it sure as hell can't be cured. Because we're not talking about a lack of something, a missing piece of some commodity, of some goods that can be replaced. The whole point of my jokes about telling the man that said he had some ignorance to leave and to leave the ignorance here is it does not exist outside of a person. If the ignorance does not exist outside the person, where in the hell do you think the knowledge is going to come from? It doesn't exist outside the person. Come on, fair is fair in the city. That's what makes it a 3D world. That fair is fair. It's only once you get around the corner that fair is not fair. When you start dealing with something that has 3 legs, then you can't always push it back and forth and they keep rocking. It can tip over. At the ordinary level, of which intelligence usually operates, apparently it can learn things. We're not arguing to the fact that you can tell ordinary intelligence that, hey, that ad I was talking about, the correct number, listen to me, if you want to call for more information, is 626-7979. So your intelligence can say, all right, I got it. 626-7979. And you can say that my intelligence, just at a crude, everyday level, has new knowledge. It was not on the basis that there was ignorance of the type that I'm trying to get you to consider that has been replaced. Now, it apparently learned something new. That's not even the point. And I'm not, of course, going to stand here and argue that it did not. It has now learned something new. And it can, in fact, learn things much more complex than that. They can go and take up new fields of science. They can learn a new language. I know all of that. But that which ordinary intelligence refers to in the human realm of ignorance, the things that humans cannot know, or that humans in general do not know, and things that I see, thus far no great promise of me knowing, but it's things I want to know. It's things that obviously other humans want to know. You know, such as, what in the hell is going on here? What's this gig of life all about? Etc. To look at that as being almost the intrinsic holes that people's intelligence is born almost as a piece of Swiss cheese, and you believe life has made the human nervous system with those holes and those gaps, believe that, all right, I've got the holes, something will fill it up. There is something somewhere to put into these gaps that will suitably fill it up, and it will replace ignorance with knowledge. That is the basis, in a sense, of almost all human activity this side of eating and fucking. Religion, psychology. Many people believe that they're looking for it, in a sense, and reading fiction, conversation, daydreaming. That this in some way is going to expand my understanding to such a degree that these holes of things that I can't understand, how can I treat my mother so poorly? I can't understand that about myself. How can I do that? I'm ignorant. And there's got to be something to fill up that ignorance. Maybe I have yet to find the right psychology book. Maybe I've yet to find the right psychiatrist. Maybe I was born in the wrong religion. I've tried to use those kind of spiritual answers of my family, my forefathers. Maybe I should try another religion. All of that's on the basis that there is a hole somewhere, there is a lack of commodity, which amounts to a noun itself of ignorance. And I'm going to replace it in that right little piece, like a jigsaw puzzle, by some knowledge. It will not happen. Never has happened, cannot happen. And some of the times you've been laughing during the last 20 minutes, or some of you might have suspected, you in fact heard why it couldn't happen. That if ignorance is not a thing, knowledge is not a thing. Because fair is fair. I told you. Fair is fair in the city. And if a man cannot leave his ignorance, if a man doesn't actually have ignorance, he says, I have some ignorance about something, well, leave it. You leave the room and you leave it here. If he cannot do that, he cannot do it the other way around. He cannot say, all right, there's some knowledge somewhere, and I'll get it. Fair is fair. There is no such thing as ignorance. Which some of you may go for that, but now how about this? There's no such thing as knowledge. They are misdiagnosed from the revolutionary view, misappropriated, misapplied adjectives for man. That's it. At any given second, it is simply an adjective. It does not exist outside of man. There is no such thing as a tree with ignorance. May I remind you for this month that just because you laugh at something doesn't mean it's funny. You know I don't mind you laughing, and many times, I guess you know, I seem to purposefully try and cause it, but just because you laugh doesn't mean that was funny. But there is no such thing as a tree with any ignorance. Never has been. There's no tree anywhere that if in some way we could impute consciousness of some kind, if I could play reality and say right now, all trees, I can snap my fingers and they're going to be able to think in a way not dissimilar to us for 5 minutes. Enough for us to go out and get a quick survey of trees and ask them, is there anything that you want to know? Is there anything that you feel ignorant about? Like the purpose of tree life, or why do birds, get in your hair and, drop stuff in your hair. Trees. If they could take their little limb and go, simply would not. A worm would not. A chimpanzee would not. I started to say a dog would not, but we sure have dance clothes for the canines. But at any rate, nothing but man would say that they had any, even if they understood what we meant. You understand? I gave them some quick intelligence, some human consciousness where they had a kind of nervous system, knowledge of our history and all about man, and they recognized what we called consciousness and what we call knowledge and intelligence. That they understood all that just the way you do at the city level. Now I said, all right, is any of that applicable to your life as a tree? No. As a worm? No. As a panther? No. As iron ore? Nope. As a mountain? Nope. We got to turn the tape over. Nope. Yeah, we got to turn the tape over. Which will give you time to write down the number again. That is 6347. Damn. That's 626. Jeez. Go ahead. Somebody understand what that ad could have done? But do all of you understand? As simple as it sounds, but by now some of you should get clear enough to understand that nobody could do that. Now the people I talked to, assuming I didn't make that whole thing up, I could get some fairly ordinary people, especially in the advertising business, because they're a little zippo in the head, most of them anyway, and I could tell them, pretty simply, I'd say that would have such an effect that they have never seen it, that people would remember that, just on the basis that you put together an ad and let a guy get there on TV and give out the goddamn wrong number? I mean, you'd be unbelievable. People would remember it, even if they didn't want the service or the goods. People would go, Jesus, did you see that? And I could even have got the guy to go, yeah, you're right. And he might have left the party with a few more drinks thinking, I'll do it. But they can't do that in the city. It just ain't right. Is everything back running? Now? How about something else to drag it from a few days back, a couple of weeks back? I said something to this effect, that you can be physical without being intelligent. That is, at any given second, I'm meaning this in the broadest sense to start it off, you can be physical without being involved with any particular strenuous intellectualizing. As witnessed by in the city, in fact, is most people's claim and belief that the less you're thinking about what you're doing in some physical activity, the better off you are. That you've got no reason to be analyzing how to do a high jump if you've got the experience and it's your turn to get out there and you run and do it, is you can in fact mess yourself up. Cramp your own style, maybe make yourself trip to try and think what all you're doing. You've got to have enough experience that you can be physical. You might be exceptionally good at some physical activity and in a sense be operating intellectually at the bare minimum. Maybe you're operating at 250 watts of physical activity and 10 watts intellectually. So you can be physical without actually thinking to any great degree. And as many of you should know by now, even those of you not so physically inclined, you can damn sure be emotional without being intellectual, to say the very least. To understate it. But, as some of you may think obvious since you already heard me say it a couple of weeks ago, let me point out, you cannot be intellectual without being intellectual. And that simple fact is not recognized by city consciousness. I guess as always I'm going to have to tell you why or try and get you to see that that's true, because look at your own city consciousness. It heard that whole setup. It sounded pretty good, I guess, running along. It was almost melodic, almost balanced itself, that you can be physical without thinking, da-da-da-da-da-da. You can be emotional without thinking, da-da-da-da-da. But you can't be intellectual without thinking, yeah, I knew that. And then we just say, no, you didn't. Consciousness in general, city intelligence in general, does not know that. And now, of course, I did all that. And then all of you sitting here and on tape, I see some of you. Then you quit going, yeah, I knew that. And you go, all right. But sure we knew it, because as soon as you said it, I knew it. I realized, well, sure, that's true. You can't be intellectual. You can't be intellectual without being intellectual. That is not recognized in the city. No way. No. The first two, they have no real occasion to even ponder or pose the first two aspects of being physical and emotional without being intellectual. But the last one for me to say that you can't be intellectual without thinking, you can't be intellectual without being intellectual, then you're going, yeah. Let me say, yeah, but nobody knows that. They go, yeah, I know it. I mean, you just said it. Maybe I didn't think about it that way, but as soon as you said it, I know that's true. That's obviously true. No, no, no. No, no. If that was obviously true, if that was correct, the city, I would not refer to sometimes with my lip snarled just for dramatic effect, because I love the city. But the city would be peopled exclusively by friends. Frips, my fictitious, reasonably insane person. Everybody in the city, at the very least, would now be operating at the level that you could pick up any dictionary and read a fair definition of intelligence. And maybe even cross-reference and look under mental. Maybe get a primer on psychology and look up mental processes. Just take whatever the city has to offer that defines what human intelligence is. If life right now had the need for city intelligence to understand that it cannot be intelligent without being intelligent, then it would at the bare minimum be operating at the level that its own definitions, not mine, not some revolutionary up on the hill off the wall view of it, but by their own view of what being intelligent is, everybody would be so. Now, I surely do not have to stomp my foot and hector any further for you to realize, without being critical of your fellow man, that you're not surrounded by people, including yourself, that operates on the basis that would fit just a crude, well, a workable, minimal definition of intelligent. You're physical enough, we'll assume, that you haven't killed yourself, some of you up until now, some of you are doing it piece by piece. But you're physical enough to get up and down the stairs, drive your car over here, get on the subway, get on a bus without tripping and killing yourself. That your emotional stability, your emotional life is such that you may be a manic depressive, but you can kind of balance it out that you're a manic on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you're depressive on Tuesday, Thursday, etc. And that you get serious blues, but you can usually run into a phone booth and do like an inverted version of Superman or Superwoman, and you hide from that. In other words, your emotional life, as strained as it may be, as clumsy as you may be physically, in some way you make it, right? Well, when it gets down to me saying that you cannot be truly intellectual without being intellectual, there is where life begins to skimp. That's where life will let people in the upper circuits drive on maypops. It will let you get to the point of trying to stay warm in a cold climb with 8-year-old polyester on. There is no recognition that you must be intelligent to be operating your intelligence. And if you still have any doubt with that, how would you explain, let's just say for a second that you can hear me and react in a fairly intelligent way, how can you explain that everyone alive on this planet that can speak, which by now includes almost all of us, has the upper end, if they can speak, then they've got the highest end of the nervous system in operation that's available on this planet generally. Now, of course, the people living in the wilds of some remote feral area of this planet do not have PhDs in economics, thank God. They do not have education, but the intelligence, if they're talking, their intelligence, thank you, is functioning. But how is it that all the way from someone with just a minimal operation of their intelligence, only need be if they're still living in that kind of semi-wilderness or wilderness environment, but all the way from that to those heads of academic departments in the city institutions, all the way across that, no one questions the fact that humanity, including themselves, does not operate at the level that they themselves. You might have a man who helped write one of these textbooks. You may find a man who helped put together the working Harvard, or whatever leading school of psychology nowadays is, the leading textbook describing the mental processes of man. We get 2 or 3 guys, or one guy, and yes, he was the head of the committee who wrote this. It's now the accepted, workable, operational definition of human intelligence circa 1989. And he cannot look at himself and realize, I do not meet the qualification that I devised, or that I helped devise, and those around me of equal peerage and standing went, that's it, we've got it, we all agreed, and not one of us recognizes that we can't do that. You do not have to be intelligent in the city. You do not have to think in any particular way, in any active way, to think in the city. You don't have to think to be intelligent. You don't have to be intelligent to think. You see, I've covered it's like a 4-box matrix again, which always ends up in the city, does it not? You don't have to be intelligent to think. You don't have to think to be intelligent. You don't have to think, and you don't have to be intelligent to be intelligent. And it is not known. It cannot be recognized. It can be recognized that they will say in degrees. And all they're down to now is, what I have summed up from top to bottom for you people, is they have simply fallen back to the great SS defense position of some success. That is as close as city intelligence can claim to be intelligent. And it cannot even recognize this, that the some success it had almost from the day it was born. Oh, I know you've learned something since then. And I'm simply giving you a way out to say almost since the day you were born. If these people, putting together my fictitious man who helped put together the 1989 operational description of human intelligence, if he actually had that kind of intelligence, and he was listening to me, not even trying to be a revolutionist, if he was just sitting here and listening to some of this, and I said, all right, can you separate what people call knowledge from your intelligence? And if, of course, if he had really been listening to that, he would say, the way you're talking, yeah. That knowledge is not a thing, it's a process. And it's a part of my process of intelligence. And I'd go, you have been listening tonight, you rascal. And then I would say, you've already admitted that you see that you cannot operate on the basis of being as intelligent, or operating at the level that you help define what human intelligence is. And he'd say, all right. And I said, but if you're that intelligent right this second, and I got you working at this speed, forget knowledge. You do see the difference between knowledge and intelligence right now. And this guy goes, all right, yeah, I guess I'm in a sweat or a heat. You got me fooled, but yeah, I do right this second. Be quick. And that's all right. Are you any more intelligent now than you were as far back as you can remember? As far, I don't care whether that you can remember your 5th birthday party. You can remember, I leave it to you, that you have some full recollection of when your memory seemed to start. And he would go, wow. Of course, then he'd faint, die, explode, or throw up on me. He'd do something. Or Larry would take that stick to me and say, stop there. Now I leave it to you to think back if you can hear this, and this is not to prove I'm right, but it is a piece of the kind of thing to learn about your own process and the complexity of things that you have taken as being very simplistic and very linear, and they're not. And that is, I'm suggesting, I almost hate to say it, but I've done everything but say it, is almost, I'll leave you that kind of room. If you could get back and see that there's been almost no change in what? Intelligence, not knowledge. But no change in your intelligence since you were blank. That is, as far back as you can remember. I don't care what it is. 2 years old, 5 years old, 8 years old, 12 years old. Maybe you're slow. Maybe you didn't have a lot to think about until the age of 12. If you could feel it, and there is something of very specific import, of a complex nature that I hate to verbalize much further, to even hint about, for you to simply realize, because it's not depressing, but to realize that intelligence is one thing, and it's been one thing only, and it has not noticeably changed as far back as I can remember. I am generally, so I'm speaking for you now, that if you're on a good warm day doing your best, ordinary city intelligence could go, I am generally no more intelligent. I am generally, intelligence-wise, the same person I was. And there surely, well, most of you, there'll be some period, or some probably one instance when you really felt intelligent. And who knows what age it was. But something that you really did. Maybe you remember some scene when your father, your mother went, gee, or whether just you. You remember some instance that you finally tripped up an adult, that you asked them something, they answered it, and then you asked them another question, and the adult went. It is in some way that you can remember that you were a conscious, intelligent human, that you were not simply a little stool-producing nipper running around. With the right kind of feel, I'm telling you, I'm suggesting to you that you can just quite clearly, you just see it, you just feel it. It's right there in your nervous system, that your intelligence is not at all hardly dissimilar from what it was then. That, I suggest to you, is real useful info. It should be useful to those of you long in this for me just telling you. All this is useful by me just telling you. I wouldn't stand up here night after night and just tell you shit. But then for you to see that that's true. And that also is that kind of nutso revolutionary proof, which there's no term for, and it's not actually proof, but once you see that, is to then realize that there is no such thing as ignorance, and there is no such thing as knowledge. They're all adjectives having to do with men, or if you can look at it another way, they're adverbs having to do with the processes of men. But what ordinary intelligence calls knowledge, got nothing to do with intelligence. Oh, it's got something to do with it. And you would understand, you would see for yourself, or begin to suspect for yourself, that the way the nervous system has grown in man, and the use that life obviously is making of man, that you can just begin to see right here in front of you, is that in the 3D world, the way I keep having to for yourself, that the way the nervous system has grown in man, and the use that life obviously is making of man, that you can just begin to see right here in front of you, is that in the 3D world, the way I keep having to conditionally describe the growth from the lower circuits, like each person's own nervous system going through, in a sense, the evolution of humanity, that the lower the circuits are, the more they can operate without this kind of intelligence, that you can be physical and, in a sense, not be intelligent. Not learned, not educated, but that you can do what I was talking about, that you can do a triple with a half gainer and whatever it is off the board. And if we could suddenly jump in your nervous system and had the kind of technology to see how much your upper circuits were in operation, to those kind of heat scans and stuff, the upper circuits are just almost, they're just operating, they're just humming. And you can be poetry in motion without being actively intelligent any more than just enough to be alive. You can be emotional. It is one of, I made sort of negative pictures for you about that you can be depressed and maniacal and not be intellectual. There's another, apparently less pejorative way to approach that, and I've mentioned this once or twice, but I think it's time to mention it again, especially since many of you have got so-called talent. I don't mean so-called in a questionable way, but what is referred to as talent, musical, art, dance. You could look upon that as being, they do in the city, as being an emotional activity, sometimes called spiritual in the city, but it's emotional as opposed to being simply physical or intellectual. And all of you here, but now you should have some feel that when you actually do a painting, when you actually do a piece of music, even when you sit down and you're writing some sketch for an Evotech play or something, when you do it, the kind that it really feels like that you created something, then if I could jump on you and have that kind of fictitious technology and ask you what kind of thought processes went into doing that, almost none. And if you, those of you that don't feel like you can see it in you, I refer you back. As always, the city has been offering evidence. It's always there you've got this strung out as far as man's been talking back in the history of somebody, of Plato, of somebody walking up to somebody, a Socrates. He's not the best example because he had other fish that he had in mind for their supper. But if somebody asking those that apparently had artistic ability, how do you do that? What do you think about when you do it? And all the way back from Homer to what was his name? I was trying to think of the Greek playwright. All the way from that up to a Picasso, to a Horowitz, to a Beethoven, to a Michelangelo, to a Martha Graham. They have asked them, what do you think about, how did you do that? And here's what happens. Some of you should be able to hear it by now. The guy, no matter who it is, the world's most famous painter we got right now, whoever it would be now, Jasper Johns or somebody, that's recognized the world over that you are the greatest living, in our opinion, contemporary painter. And by now there's books and books. People have gotten degrees chewing on him, writing about interpreting what he's done and what it signifies. People have gotten PhDs off of him, off his work, of this guy standing around that, I don't know, maybe had a 10th grade education, and he's painting. And now they ask him, well, at the time's come, you're old enough now, you're the godfather, you're the elder statesman of Western painting. And it's time, try to let us know, we want to do this in-depth interview here with PBS or for the Serious Art News. You've heard all the other interpretations of what's been made of your work. I think it's time for you to speak up yourself now. You've always been rather tacit about what you do. Tell us what goes on. Let's start with this painting. What did you have in mind and what does it represent? And here's the truth. Is internally, all of these people go, Jesus. They might as well be rabbits sitting in a field and you certainly turn a flashlight on them. Instead of a flashlight, they're holding out, a microphone from a tape recorder for the interview, or the camera's rolling. And they're even already pre-sold interviews about all the great interpretations and how well you thought of. That's not in question. They just say, now tell us, what does it represent? What were you actually thinking when you did it? And of course, they may not do that externally, but inside, of the high of their nervous system, the place that's got to answer their intelligence, it goes, simply because of this. When it was doing that, and even looking at it now, this was not much more operational than it was for the pole vaulter or the high diver at the time he was executing his physical activities. The truth is simply this. And every now and then they say this, and everybody just ignores it. They ask some artist, some composer, how do you do this? And historically, what they'll say is, sometimes I don't know, which people don't even hear that. They go, oh, come on, tell us. Then they'll fall back to, I don't know, it seems to be a gift from God. To tell you the truth, I don't know, it's like some kind of, and then they'll start taking a few notes. But they're still saying, I don't know. And they'll start saying, well, I don't know, when I'm just right. Of course, the Greeks and some of the others used to call it the muses, the spirits would work on me. But what they're saying is, and sometimes now they'll say, well, it's like I'm on some sort of open channel for creative energy flowing through the universe. It's all the same thing. They're saying, I do not know. And they're also saying, I don't think about it. I never even thought about it until you asked me. And now I still can't think because I wasn't thinking then. They can't say this because they don't understand it that way. So, I use that to show you again that even though people say that they understand it, they don't fully understand that you can be emotional. You can even be creative in the human sense. I'm talking about really creative, recognized as being a great whatever, painter, artist, sculptor, composer. But as far as them sitting down and there was some sort of plan, and that does not exclude literature, and they would say, how did you write this poem? These 22 lines has survived 50 years. It's changed people's lives. Or this little book, this little piece of fiction. It's the only book you ever wrote. But do you know how many generations of college students in the last 30 years have read this book and would right now, if you ask them the most important book in their life, I'll bet you, more than the Bible, they would say this book. Those that at least went to college and read that kind of literature, that they would say probably more than the Bible or any book they ever studied in school was this one little 127-page piece of fiction. And you find the guy and say, you realize it's a masterpiece. To take allegory instead of 800 pages like Moby Dick, you got it down without whales, and you got it down in contemporary times to just a boy and a girl, a classroom, and 2 loaves of French bread. But the significance, the metaphorical impact this has had upon several generations of readers is sans parallel. Just tell us now. I mean, it's recognized the world over, translated into blah, blah number of languages. What kind of effort? I mean, how did you plan? What were you thinking when you did it? Now, of course, I'm inferring now it's not just a run-of-the-mill something. It's that which the city recognizes as being exceptional, a piece of art. And they understand it when it is in their own way. The truth is, and sometimes these guys will say it again, the truth is, when that kind of thing comes out, if you don't know it, that sucker sat down at the typewriter, something he types, and suddenly it was, and he probably typed the whole thing straight through. Now, I know there are variations and some exceptions, but when it reaches a certain point, and if you get good, you can just pick up and almost feel a book. Once you know that it's real hot and everybody's talking about it, you can just almost pick it up, or maybe just glance at the jacket, and you can feel. Well, I just don't go into that. That the guy or woman sat down, and in just a flurry, just that heat of some creative moment, as some of them will try to say, I don't know, it just came to me. I didn't rewrite. What you see is what I did. And the reporter will go, are you kidding? You're fooling. No, I'm serious. My other works. You remember that other work, you know, the one 2 years before that won the National Book Award? Oh yeah, we all liked that. I mean, it wasn't this level. Did you know that I rewrote that thing from beginning to end at least 3 times? I'm talking about completely. Really? But you're saying this one? This one? I'm telling you, I sat down. I might as well admit, I wrote that thing in less than 4 hours, non-stop. No. Yeah, I did. They should not be amazed. And nowadays they may try to say, they'll also bring in that they can't do that all the time, but it's like when it's right, and it must be based upon all the years it's been percolating in my system. It's like a culmination of all the little experiences and all the little ideas I've had. It's no such fucking thing. No, okay, it is. That's the way you want it. The point is, they can do that without intellect. That the guy sat there and wrote that, or the woman did, in 5 hours, non-stop, just floated through them. And if we could take a measure of what was going on right here at the high end of their nervous system, not much more than the pole vaulter. Those that can, I might say, gives you something to think about, don't it? And the ordinary intelligence goes, well, as a matter of fact, no. Because that's all nutso. Because that can't be true. If that was true, what you call the city wouldn't work. Contraire. As always, I love it, fair is fair. They got it backwards. If it weren't that way, things wouldn't work. But they say if it was that way, things wouldn't work. Yeah. But see, at least they're close. Well, it's not like they're just a little off. They're completely off. I had another little piece of something. I said I had 2 and I was going to play Baptist. How about another story? I heard 2 guys. Let me see. I got to write it fast or running out of tape. Here we go. I heard a couple of guys one time talking. And one of them said, they got talking about hobbies and stuff. And this one guy was always collecting books. Just had become sort of his thing throughout life. And And one of the guys said, "You still got all those books?" "Yeah." He said, "Is your house and apartment still just full?" And he said, "Yeah, I got them. I can't even get them organized." And so he talked a while more and drank coffee. And the other guy, the book collector, says, "Hey, you know what? I just had like an idea for like a story or something." He said, "It's this guy, not unlike me, but there's this guy, and he collects books. Just all the spare money he's got. He's not psychotic. It's not to the point that he needs help, but it's like it's just a harmless hobby. He's not, let's say he's not married, he has no great relationships going on. And all his life he's liked books. He used to like to read in college. So he picks up books all the time. He goes into new cities on vacation. He'll end up, after a few hours at the beach or the casino, he'll wander around and look for bookstores. And his buddies, drink coffee, yeah. He said, "What just struck me is some kind of story." Because everybody, or a lot of people have little hobbies like this. But how about this? One day it strikes the guy. He just gets this funny feeling that as long as I keep getting books, that is, I've got more books on hand that I own than I've read, that I'm always behind, as long as I've got that situation, I won't die. As long as I've got books unread, I won't die. And maybe his drinking buddy goes, yeah, that's kind of neat. And then the guy says, "You know what?" He said, "If I was a writer, that's the kind of thing, that'd be a good premise for a short story. Maybe even a novel, but at least for a short story." And his buddy goes, yeah. But the first guy then takes another sip of coffee and at least thinks to himself, "No, that was not a good premise for a short story. That is the fucking story." Think about it a second. You understand I was speaking for ordinary intelligence throughout all that. That the guy said, "All right, if I was a writer, there is a premise for a good story." And maybe he was sitting there thinking, "All right, maybe I will write one." That there it is. But then he started thinking about, all right, where does that go to? And you realize that ain't the premise. That's the story. All right, you follow? Now that goes on all the time. Don't just stay there with my little made-up example. Because here it is. That in life, in city life, everything is a premise. That's still not a period. Don't just go and say, "Well, I was a little ahead of you." No. Everything is not only a premise, but you've got to understand that the premise is the payoff. The setup is the conclusion. All right, get past my example of this guy that I made up. At first he said, all right, the idea that this guy had that has just a small, fairly harmless mania about getting books. And he knows, he'll admit it, and everybody knows that he's got hundreds, maybe thousands of books he's never read, and he can't stop and catch up and read the ones. Let's assume that he intended to read each and every book he bought at the time, but he hasn't read them, so why does he keep getting them? And then it strikes him. One day he's thinking, why do I keep buying books when I've got enough books at home that I haven't read that would take me easily 2 years? If I sat down for 5 hours a day, it'd take me 2 years, so why not keep getting other books? And then he thinks, well, God, that's almost a short story of some kind, or maybe a Rod Serling TV kind of thing, that is, in some way something's happened spooky with weird music, in the background, that this guy, for some reason, has stumbled upon almost a way to immortality. And he thinks, what a premise for a story. But then let's assume he had some kind of intelligence. And he thought, well, where does it go after that? Yeah. There's nowhere it can go, because the premise is the payoff. Yeah. Now, this has, if I got enough time, this has, for those of you that can try and see around corners, it has some very, very interesting and never recognized, never identified ramifications. The human intellect, and the way in which it manifests itself, let me pick out obvious ones. Novels, movies, TV, all the same thing. They're all on this basis, that if they qualify as having any popularity at all, some segment of people read a book and forget their criticism of all the aspects of the craft of writing. Anyway, it qualifies as a novel or a short story or a movie. Yeah, it was a movie, whether you enjoyed it or not. It qualified as a movie. Understand that it started off, seemed to have done something, and then seemed to have a conclusion. All right? The human nervous system must put together all of these, which is simply hardwired reflections or hardware of its own hardwired self, that in these movies, in the scripts, in novels, in short stories, it has to save the premise for last, and it does not recognize it. It believes that any decent movie, script, novel, short story has got to have two things, right? It's got to have a premise, a setup, and then it's got to have a payoff, or it is really a bomb. Now, of some kind, right? Of some kind. All right, how about my story? What if they're going to make let's say, a little TV thing about this guy that believes he stumbled on some form of immortality? That as long as he keeps getting new books that he hasn't read, that in other words, he never catches up on his own self-imposed or regimen of reading, his collection of books, he never gets through all those books. And as long as that situation remains, he won't die. So let's assume that some very good TV producer gets his stable of writers and they decide to do this. What are they going to do with it? They hear the idea and perhaps they go, God, that's a great idea. We'll do that on that anthology of science fiction or weird stuff, fantasy things are going to run this summer. We'll do that. But they, without exception and without knowing it, believe that they're going to have a setup for the movie, the script, the short story, and then it lead to some kind of payoff, which is the end of the movie, the novel, the TV show. Whatever seemed to be your personal reaction to it, you know that, all right, there's the ending. There is the payoff. What would be the payoff in this situation? The payoff, they've got no choice, would be the premise. And they can't see it. It would have to be something like this. That they describe that this is what's going on. This is what he believes to be true. And one day he goes off to buy some new books. And he goes off and he forgets that today is Christmas or New Year's and all the bookstores in town are closed, so he can't get any new books. So he goes back home, and as he goes around the corner he hears the sound of what? Fire trucks. And he gets around the corner and they can do close-ups of his face. Oh my God, no, no, no. Around the corner, his house has burned completely to the ground. And there he stands, stripped. Not only the books he used to have that he hadn't read, but he didn't have one single new one there to protect him. All right? Now, would they not, to continue with my little made-up scenario, that sounds about as reasonable as any, does it not? And maybe just there he stands. Or they make him do that, and they go back and they show at some bookstore right down the street, closed the one day of the year, happy holidays. All right? That would appear to be, even though I'm describing it, that would appear to be the payoff. But do you hear me? That is not the payoff. Well, it is in the city, but it is the premise itself. Once you have the premise, if any of you having trouble with this and we're running out of tape, take my premise that the guy believes, one guy believes, that as long as he has books that he personally bought and selected, that he wants to read at the time, as long as he can have books on hand that he has yet to read, death cannot get him. All right, let's take that is a worthwhile, that's an interesting premise. It has some promise. What is the payoff? Write me a short story. Do it right now in your head. Where's that going to go? Now, I don't mean that you can't make up something. Well, he believes that, and then one day he's in a bus station, and a guy walks up to him and says, are you the guy that believes that you won't die if you have books you hadn't read? And he says, yes, how'd you know that? He said, never mind, I know that, but let me tell you what, it's not true. And he goes, oh. End of story. So you can say that was a payoff, but you do understand nobody's going to pay for that. They're going to burn your theater down to try to pass that off as a movie. They're going to take your book and throw it in the toilet. So you can, but I'm asking you, what, once you hear a premise that's intriguing, assuming you found mine intriguing, if not, make up your own or pick out a movie, something you've seen. It apparently has a setup, a premise, and it apparently has a payoff. But it does not. The premise and the payoff are the same thing. And ordinary intelligence cannot see it. It doesn't go anywhere. And that's why they apparently, and nobody has ever thought this, they can't think in this way, but in some very basic non-thinking way, those involved with so-called creative art such as writing do understand that what they're trying to do is take the premise. They don't look at it, nobody ever has in this way, but they take the premise, and what they try to do is, let's assume that the premise of the story is like maybe a mole underground. And what they try to do is to hold down the mole. It's like a ferret under the covers of your bed, and it's going from the foot of the bed to the head of the bed. And what they try to do is hide it. And they try and just let you see like a little piece of the ferret's tail, just a little bit, and they try to call that the premise. But the premise is going to be the conclusion. If you follow the story, it's going to be up at the head of the bed to let the ferret jump completely out and say, that's the payoff. The way people go, oh, what a surprise, what a delightful ending to the story. But the ending to the story, the payoff, was there in the beginning. It was the premise. And all human intelligence tries to do is deal on the basis of some. That nobody has ever looked at it this way, is they take what they call the premise and they turn it into the payoff, and then they're stuck, well, how do we start this? Of course, the greatest way to start it is apparently cold. The greatest start in the world, or the one that most of you know, is go check in a motel, settle down, open up the drawer in the bed, and there's normally a book in there that the Gideons provide. And open it up, forget all the first pages or intros, turn to the first page, and there you have a sterling, if not golden example, that everything's a premise, all payoffs are simply the premise, hidden. And when I said the only way to actually do it is cold, is either clear blue sky, you say, in the beginning, which I believe is the opening of the Old Testament, the Christian Bible. If not, the variations are you go into a movie, they roll the credits, let's say, and get all them out of the way. It's just got a plain background, no people. And so the credits get through. The last one nowadays, I guess, is directed by so-and-so. And it goes black for a second. And then the movie comes on, and there's our hero. He's standing out in the middle of New Mexico thumbing. That is, in the beginning, there is the premise, they say. But that is also the conclusion. It is going to be the adjectives and the adverbs applicable to this process of this man, assuming it's about a man, if not about the woman, the heroine. Ordinary intelligence, we're out of tape, but ordinary intelligence cannot perceive the fact that everything is a premise. That was where my little scenario started. The guy thinking, what a great premise. I wish I had an ability to write. I'd turn that into a story. And then he thought, well, what would be the payoff? Where do I go from that? That's a great premise, that the guy won't die as long as he got books he won't read. All right, where do I go from that? That is great. I love that. There ain't nowhere to go with that. But then, for those of you that can face up to the harsh reality, in city affairs, there ain't nowhere to go with nothing. Oh, no, you didn't have to say that. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. It was in the script here. I had to say it. Again, I point out it is not any cause for pessimism, but it's to see that ordinary intelligence tells you that there is a setup to everything, not just movie scripts and novels, but to a human relationship between two people, in starting a new business, and how you handle your relationships with your family, in trying to replace some ignorance you have with some knowledge. That there is a premise, and assuming that you're lucky, assuming that you are diligent, assuming that the gods smile upon you, you go from the premise, the setup, to some payoff, to some, in some manner. You go from a beginning to some sort of end. But I prefer, what I'm trying to get you to encourage you, is from some sort of premise that, well, all right, da-da-da-da-da, so I'll go from there. Ain't nowhere to go. The premise is the payoff. I started real late on the tape for this, didn't I? But if nothing else, since the tape's out, if you will look at every book you've ever read that amounts to anything, that qualifies as a book or a short story or a movie, they try. Sometimes they try to do it backwards, which is the same thing, so don't let that throw you. But what they do is try and hide the payoff, of course. You know, the final whodunit. Who was the murderer? All right, so they try to hide that, the payoff. But they can't. Oh, in the city they can, but they can't because there is no payoff. There is simply the premise. And after that, it's stalling around. After that is to find some way to try to keep the ferret under the covers for 90 minutes so that you would have paid $6 or $10 to see the movie. You just try and let a little foot out at the cover to start with, a piece of his tail, to where you go, Martha, did you see that? Was that a ferret or a beaver? Plus, if it really was a ferret or a beaver, what was it doing under the covers? Well, I don't know. Shh, let's watch the movie. You understand what I've seen tonight? That there is no knowledge, there is no intelligence, it is not a thing. Everybody is waiting for the premise to turn into a payoff, for the setup to reach the finish of the movie or the story. And it never does. And nobody knows why. Nobody is satisfied with it. People keep trying to redo the story. They try to interpret the story. They think, well, perhaps the premise was good. You know, of asking, is there a God? The premise was good of wondering, what happens to me after I die? The premise was good of wondering, what makes me treat the women I get involved with in such an ungentlemanly fashion? All right, that's a good premise. All right, now, where can I go with that? Sir, madam, nowhere. There is nowhere to go. It's not a matter that I got a good premise and I can't come up with a finish. Yeah, you can. The premise is the finish. But ordinary intelligence just tries to hide it. Life makes it you apparently hide it from yourself. It's like, well, if I don't look in the mirror, if I hide, I won't realize how ugly I am until maybe I'm, 79, and I'm dying, and they hold up a mirror to my nose to see if I'm still breathing, and maybe I'll get a glimpse right there at the end. And that'll be the finish. But up until then, I won't look. Up until then, I just keep wondering, was that a ferret? Was that a ferret? Maybe it could have even been a lynx or a minx, but we're completely out of audio? Oh, are we? Well, since I plan to quit, I will quit anyway. Well, I just started to say that you can look around you, because this can get pretty sticky if I continue with it verbally. But you can see it around you in those easily, or should be observable ways, such as that seem to be distant from you, such as novels, movies, TV shows. That there is, and it doesn't have anything to do with the ability of the writers. It's true as far as the human intellect has been operating on the basis to write down things, whether it be plays or stories or the history of what happened. It is right there before you that apparently things are in some kind of little progression, little packets of some kind of movement, that there's a premise. And it doesn't have to be just literature. It can be a premise like King so-and-so, 427 BC, tells the adjoining king, that mountainous property between us two that you now claim, my grandfather said that one time that was ours. There's your premise, right? Another king says, I'll think about it. So we got the movies rolling along. You see the movement on the middle of the bed. You still wonder. The other king comes back and he says, I've decided that that's not true, and if you want it, you got to come take it. So he says, so be it. And they fight, and it takes up another hour of the movie, another 20 pages of the short story, another 200 pages of the novel. And the first king defeats the other king, takes the property that was in dispute, tells him to go away. Maybe his final words was, I told you that was our property. I told you that belonged to us. And that guy says, well, I guess you did. And he says, that which is just will prevail, or something like that. And it apparently that there went from some setup to a payoff, from some premise historically. Now we're not talking about literature. I'm pretending that actually happened, that sort of thing. That something apparently went from a premise of one guy said, you're treating us unjustly. You're transgressing on us. And the guy says, well, stuff it. He says, I'll stuff you. And apparently it goes from that. But that was the payoff. It does not move from a premise. A premise does not move into a payoff. That in a sense, everybody is trying to work backwards. That's not the way it appears. For the intellect to try and hide the premise and not turn it into some sort of payoff. If you could see, I'm going to stop because I know it's getting sticky. In a certain way, everybody's running backwards. How about those of you who got a little charge a few nights ago when I pointed out that in a quite real sense that I'm not limiting to just my verbal description, a few of you thought you heard, is time does not operate as though that the future is something that hasn't happened. It's something that hasn't happened here, but if it hasn't happened somewhere, it's not going to happen here. Does anybody see a connection between that and at the city level, that is in the 3D world, all premises are everything? That's it. The premise is the payoff. And in a sense, people are attempting to work backwards. They're attempting to hide the premise. It's almost as though they know the knowledge to start with, and they try to turn it into ignorance. Well, I don't actually know that. It's that we all know the payoff at the city. No, I don't. And so it's almost as though you go backwards and then try to turn the payoff into a premise, such as, all right, I am going to stop, but I'll give you this one. Such as, everybody on this planet, let's just put it directly, knows they're going to die. So now what? Everybody begins to back up going, all right, what if you don't actually die? And then somebody else says, yeah, you're getting close. How about this? What if, all right, it looks like you die, but then you come alive somewhere else? And I'm doing this linearly, like going this way is like moving the past, and they begin to back up from what from one view was a kind of knowledge of something, and they turn into an ignorance to the point that what if, maybe they have taken the original, what was simply a premise and a payoff, and now apparently brought it into question. Apparently tried to bring up other possibilities. But they cease being possibilities, they cease to be seen as beliefs, then they become facts. But there are people now stand up and say, oh, you want to know what happens when you die? I'll be glad to tell you. And they'll tell you. If you have a good premise, remember my little story. If you have a good premise and you think, well, that's a good premise, but where do I go from there? You're there. A complexly correct paradigm not only eats itself up, but it correctly suggests an additional step. But not backwards. Not toward more simplistic times, and it does not delude consciousness and intelligence into believing that a premise is a payoff or that a payoff is a premise. It's all a premise. And once you've got a premise, there is no need. Once you understand this, once you can feel it yourself, there's nowhere to look about, well, now that's an interesting premise, but if I was going to make a story out of that, God, that's a good idea. Jesus. But now wait a minute, what would I have the character do after that? I mean, the premise is so great, but and what you're saying is there is no payoff to match the premise. The premise that, hey, as long as I got books, personally, that I bought, that I acquired through my own labor, that I picked out, and I've got them here, and I have at least one, just one, that I haven't read, then death cannot get me. God, I love that idea, but now what would he do? Where would we go? I'm suggesting to you that nothing, and think of your own example, nothing will top the premise. And so then the way it operates in life, it's as though, this is what it amounts to, that then the guy is so in love with the premise, and he keeps trying to think, well, what would be the payoff? How can you reach a climax that's more intriguing than that? And you can't. And so then it's like he's moving backwards, all right? That's the premise, but I can't tell everybody out front, or the story's going to be, in my short story, is going to be a paragraph long. The movie would last 2 minutes. So I can't do that. So then you take the premise, and it's almost as though you try to turn it inside out. You try to cram the premise down in a box under the cover, and then try to move backwards and think, all right, if I get back far enough, now how can I sneak up on the premise and make it appear to be the payoff? That is what all human intellectual activity is, from science to literature, to the descriptions of what kind of guy you are. That the premise was there, the knowledge was there, and you back up to the point, this is what it amounts to, that, well, I don't actually know that for sure. Really? It's surprising what you can forget once you've been born in the city. Yes, now that I'm well educated and fairly successful, I got to admit I have forgotten almost everything that I ever knew. But no matter. I bet you'd agree, most of you, if you're with us, that that's probably enough for one night, isn't it? Don't go out in the woods with your flashlights either.